here, you fucking crazy cat.
Looks like we have got a small friend. We will need the blessings from this one.
Ladies, gents, welcome back to the shop. I'm Handy Andy, and today we're actually going to do a little bit of a fun video, not so much a regular maintenance video like we're usually doing. Today, we're actually going to install a public address system in our Volvo XC90. What a public address system does is it takes your voice from this little microphone, amplifies it, and puts it out through the speaker. This microphone will be in your cabin, this one will be outside of your cabin, so now you can sing Ludacris's Move to anyone in the way. Let's get started. Now, I'm not going to bore you with too much semantics about how this PA system works. All I can say is that it works. I've tested it out. However, there is a few things that I need to explain in order for us to install this right, get to know it, and then know exactly what happens whenever we do something with the system. So, a public address system is merely an amplifier. You say what you want through this mic. It goes into this little box full of, magic pixies and stuff. And it comes out here. And so, all it requires is a 12-volt source. With these systems that you can buy from any of your usual suspects like AutoZone or O'Reilly's, actually come with a fusible link to your positive connection of the battery. That's super safe, and the reason being, like, if anything in here fails, that fuse will actually burn out and prevent a fire. So now that we know what's going on, let's get it in the car and then try it out. But first, there's a few things we need to do to this. For instance, these cables are much too short. In our Volvo XC90, the battery's actually in the rear, so we're either gonna have to tap into a main line of something that can handle something like this, or we're going to have to run a really long wire with the right gauge to the actual battery itself to this module. So we're gonna have to figure that out on the fly. Either way, you're gonna learn with me. Come on.
Okay, and for any weird install like this, where it's going to include running some lines, we're actually going to need to take some measurements and then figure out where we want components, such as our control box. We want it close to the driver's seat so you can control whatever you want. It has 3 modes, one for your voice, one for like animal sounds, and then one for sirens. Obviously, this is an off-road use only kind of thing. So we want it there somewhere, hidden, but accessible. And then now that we understand where we want everything, the mic and control box there, we need to figure out how to get it some power. Maybe we can run a wire all the way to the battery in the back. However, something that you should probably know really quickly, AC and DC current are quite different. So if you think, oh yeah, how much can a little megaphone take, if my house wires are relatively thin? That's not the case with DC current, man. You actually need a really thick gauge wire to handle any sort of amperage with a DC current, which all vehicles run on. And so the actual kit itself actually comes with directions, so this is more of just a install, how-to, and in-depth video. What we're actually looking for is any markings that say how much this draws. I do remember the instructions saying it was like 10 amps or something like that. And so now we're kind of just looking for a good spot to put our megaphone. So what we really want is for it to be in a downward facing position, kind of angled forward. The reason being is if you get water in here and it collects, it'll actually ruin the megaphone. So we are gonna have to do a little bit digging with a flashlight to see if there's any usable space. And so for the sake of filming, I'm actually going to perform this in my shop. That way I can give you guys a better chance of seeing what I'm actually trying to show you. So we're just trying to find a place to be able to hang our megaphone. We're just going to find out where we want to mount it. Obviously, you can't mount it there next to the windshield washer bottle or the fog light. This is all covered up. And something, again, that you don't want to do is place it next to a component that generates a lot of heat. There's ample amounts of space up top in the engine bay. However, heat rises and your engine is burning gasoline all the time. So that means it gets hot in there. However, I think we found our candidate. So it looks like we can be able to place this right here on the inside of the fender well, pointed down to allow for the egress of water, and it's still outside the vehicle with a relatively wide cutout that we could actually get sound to be channeled out of here. I think this is it. And here we're going to go over some of the things you're going to need. We're going to need a pair of dikes. This is going to help us trim our wires, cut them, do everything we need. We need some standard grade nuts and bolts. We need our handy dandy hand of the service manager medallion thingy. We need extra wiring. Reason being is just we're running the entire length of the vehicle. I have chosen speaker wire. Reason being, it's actually all copper on the inside. So you won't have any like signal carry problems whenever you have to make the megaphone to the actual box itself. You won't get any weird stuff with other metals, you know. And then next up, we're gonna try these. These are sort of cool. What you do is you stick the two ends of the wires you want to mate up in the other opposite directions. There's a little bit of solder right there, low temperature solder, and some heat shrink bands right there, and the entire thing is inside a heat shrink too. So all you do is you insert a wire in one end and in the other end that you want to conjoin, and you hold a lighter to it, or a heat gun, or something that produces heat. Something like this, we're going to need a drill. You don't have to have necessarily the best bits in the world. A little Chinesium pair will do you good. However, we're only drilling a few holes and mainly just to mount hardware. Now here we are at a different bench. What we're going to actually do right now is we're going to establish the connections for the megaphone. That way we have an easier time mounting it and running wires. If you got a predetermined length of wires, say you're like, oh, I need 3 feet, and then you mount it and then try to solder inside the car. One, that's a problem because you're inside the car soldering. Two, if it actually ends up being, you know, a lot less than you actually needed, the way I'm actually going to do it is joining it to the entire bundle of wire. That way I could just cut off whatever I need when we're about ready to mount the box. So let's go. So all we're gonna do, we're gonna take our dikes here, right? We're gonna take that sharp edge, see how there's a weird indent on this side, but there's not on this side. And the way you strip wires with one of these is actually fairly simple. First, let's split the speaker wire by pulling the two ends apart, like so. And then the way to actually strip the plastic lining on a wire, you gently hold pressure with your dikes on the wire, and you simultaneously pulling with this hand. I like to actually keep my finger on the actual dikes itself to push off, and then when you do that, you'll actually strip the wire and almost knock over your very expensive camera. So now that we have all 4 ends are positive and negative for the megaphone, and are positive and negative for our regular our speaker wire, we can actually figure out what the polarity is on this component. It's very important that you get positive and negative right, or else some funky dunky stuff starts to happen and you don't want that. However, most components are actually kind of clearly labeled. You just got to know what you're looking for. See this white line on this black wire? That's actually signifying to us that is a positive. Black or green or brown in the car world tend to be the colors for universal grounding. So if you look for a black wire, usually it tends to be a ground wire. And for instance, on the speaker wire that I've chosen, you'll actually see the same thing. The positive end of the speaker wire actually has a red stripe going down the entire length of the wire. So if you're ever confused, you could actually look into whether it's positive or negative by just looking at the identifying markings on the wire itself. And this will keep everything relatively easy for us. We don't have to do a polarity check every time we make a connection. So what you want to do, best practice, is you want to twist the wire, the exposed strands of this braided copper wire. What that's going to do is help you with inserting it into our soldering device, as well as make a neat and maintained look. So after you twisted that and it's all nice and straight, let's get like a black background. Cool. So we're going to take one of our soldering devices and we're going to slide it to where the wire is actually just a bit past where that little soldering metal is. And then we're going to take the positive of our speakerphone. Look, it has a white stripe. Look, red stripe. And then we're going to slide this in the other side, just past. And so now, these wires are ready to be conjoined. And now this video is sponsored by Fire. So all we do, you take your lighter, and you're going to run it along the entire length of this heat shrink solder tubing. You're going to want to do it relatively fast. Reason being, you don't want to stay on a certain area too long, or you actually start to burn the wire. And so now I'm trying to concentrate a little bit more of the heat on the inside. That way I can get that solder to melt. And it looks like it just melted. It turned shiny. And it looks like solder has flowed through the rest of the wiring. So let's let this cool and see what we got. Now that we have actually let it cool off, you can see that it's held in really tight. Actually, I'm pulling on it with fairly good force, way more than you'll actually see in the environment in your vehicle. So it's ugly, however, it does its job. It heat shrunk to keep the exposed wire encased. It has these little heat shrink bands to keep water from ingressing, and it has the little solder joint, and those all worked actually fairly well. I can't wait to test this in the vehicle. Let's do the other side and then mount our megaphone. So to get started with the mounting process, all I'm doing is I'm finding a spot on the inside of the fender well of this Volvo here. I'm gonna put my hand behind there, kind of feel around. What I'm looking for is wires or anything that would get in the way. However, I don't feel any of that here. It's a completely void space. I think I'm gonna use it for a lot more other cool projects in the future. However, for the ease of drilling, so you don't have to take off the whole bumper, you can actually go from the outside here. All I'm gonna do is find the best place. So maybe high up here, there's no hardware behind here, there's ample space. I'm going to angle it so the speaker is pointing out of that crack that leads towards the middle of the car. I'm gonna mark it with a Sharpie where I wanna mount it. That way, when we drill or burn a hole through this fender well, it'll be in the exact spot. Use the bracket for reference. You might have to take off a nut and a bolt, but it helps out when installing. Now, with a drill bit the same size as the bolt you're going to use to mount it, those little spots we made, we are actually going to drill them out. And because it's plastic, you really don't have to drill a pilot hole. Just make sure you're controlling the drill carefully. You don't want that thing to pierce through anything you don't want, or stuff like that. Go slow and steady wins the race every time.
you got 2 holes.
Now with one of your nuts and one of your bolts, we're going to put the bracket on the back end of this fender well, and we're going to run the bolt through it. Or the nut, that might actually be easier. So all you do, you put the right size bolt in there, follow it with your hand, and try and find the holes you just drilled out. So now we've got both bolts hand threaded. We could easily just go in there, hold the bolt with a wrench, and then with this socket we can actually snug them down. That way this thing is mounted and it's not going anywhere. Especially on this fender well, there's going to be a lot of vibration, but we don't really worry about that too much in this instance, where it's not something that relies on a stable environment to operate. Okay, so now we have our megaphone hooked up, wired up, and then now we're going to run the wire into the cabin where we could actually mount the control box and get that all squared away. Now, we're going to take the screwdriver with the pokey end, and we're just gonna massage this grommet plug with. Oh, it's right there. You can't see it. Now I've fished the wire out from the bottom of the vehicle to the top. And somehow we're able to run this along the side of the vehicle into that little hole we just created. And then from there, we're gonna have to see where it pops out in the driver's area. It shouldn't be too hard. Alright, so we have the wire going in that little hole with the grommet. Make sure once you get the wire through properly, the proper length, everything, replace that grommet. You can do it from the inside. That actually helps out a lot more than trying to fit my big old American paws in, this Swiss disaster here. We have our wire, and now all we're gonna do, we're gonna mount the control box somewhere, and then we're gonna figure out the power situation. Okay, so we got this little control module. I'm not gonna say what brand this is, only because you can find them everywhere in all your hardware stores. But there's 4 sets of wires coming from this, barring the microphone. So, remember how we were like, hey, you gotta get the polarity right for the speaker? Alright, so we have our speaker wire. You can tell they're conjoined together, typically in these situations. Remember, the white one is positive with the black stripe, and then the completely black one is the ground, the negative. And so, from here, that's to our megaphone. We still need power inside here. How we're going to do that? So, we're actually going to wire up the megaphone first, cut the wire, make the connections, and then the rest of the wire we're actually going to utilize to make these power connections. This red one obviously is going to be your positive. This one also has a fusible link in there, so you actually want to keep this wire relatively visible, just in case you have to replace this in a catastrophic failure event of this thing. But all this little fuses is a really thin piece of wire rated at a certain amperage or a certain current rating, and if it exceeds that current rating, it'll actually melt that wire in there, and then that's how you create a fuse. And so whenever, say, worst case scenario, this thing does a dead short to ground, and you have current from the battery running through this wire, very thin wire, unchecked, this will actually heat up quite a bit and cause a fire. So make sure you have an assembly with a fuse, or you're going to have to make your own fused connection, which is kind of easy. All it is an inline fuse. So now that we know what we're doing, let's get this all dressed up to be mounted, and then let's mount it somewhere convenient for the driver. So grab your typical Phillips head screwdriver, something that will not immediately cam out of your screws, and we're going to actually mount these right out of the car. That way it's just less of a hassle to figure it out in the future, especially when we're in the driver's little pod thing area, in the driver's seat area, and then we're upside down, we're sweating because it's hotter than the devil's taint in the shop, And then, you know, you don't want to be fiddling with brackets and stuff like that. You want to do them outside of the car. That way, this goes relatively easy and you're not going to pull your hair out. And so all we're really going to be doing is we're going to find a good position. I don't like stuff like this being that crazy visible. And something that will allow articulation of the vehicle wherever their adjustment points are, like, you know, the collapsible and height adjustment steering wheel. Now, as you can see, I use those little self-tapping screws to drill into the plastic with just my handy-dandy screwdriver. But you can't see it from a normal position, and it doesn't get in the way of any of the pedals, which is what we want. So now that we've gone ahead and pulled the wire semi-tight, you don't want it too crazy tight, but enough to make it look clean. It's all the way through there. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna cut a good portion of this wire. Reason being, we only need it to go so far. We don't need all this excess. That just, you know, makes us use a lot more energy than we need in order to drive the megaphone. However, those wires to the megaphone, we can now make the connection to it. And then this is mounted. All we have to do is get a power now, and we can test it out. So now, what I've gone ahead and done is I've made the connections for the power to the module itself. So I got my negative connection and my positive connection. And so this wire is already pre-ran through the firewall, so we don't have to suffer through that anymore. So let's go make a connection to ground, and then we gotta find a positive where we could draw power. Let's go do it. So looking around the engine bay, what we're looking for is a place to put our ground. And the ground is just that. It's a place that bolts into the chassis, like right here. And then all these little wires actually lead into the negative side of the battery. And so all I've done is I've backed off this bolt, just the blonde one. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna lay this wire under the bolt, like so. That way it's making full metal on metal contact with the chassis. And then we're just gonna tighten this thing down until it's snug. So again with this one, all we're doing is first putting the socket on the damn thing, bolt off. Just a skosh. That way, we can slide our wire under there. First but I can hear Simon already. So let's go turn everything up, get everything tested out, get the engine started, and see what we got. And so, all I've done to clean up the wiring was I put it under the carpet. You're gonna fold it back, tuck the wiring neatly back there, and then fold it in. Righty, engine's running, nothing blew up, which is also cool. So all you do, get the volume on, and then now you have your miniature microphone, and then we can test it. Hello. And so now from here, all we do, I guess we test it out. We gotta find a pedestrian that's walking awfully slow, and then tell them to move. There's one there now.